Greetings. This is Joe Green, head pastor of St. Paul Missionary Baptist Church, located in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, also the founder of the 2019 movement. And I want to share a couple of thoughts with you. I took a little bit before I really addressed the what happened on January the 6th, the siege on the Washington, D.C. Capitol. But I wanted to add that into the series that I'm doing on white supremacy. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to the other videos, please do so. Please subscribe to my channel. Please share the videos. I think it's so much important information out here that that needs to be heard and needs to be shared, but from a balanced and biblical perspective, right? Being a pastor, we always have to view everything from a biblical lens, also from an accurate and historical balanced lens. And, I'm a historian. I do a lot of research. And so I like to share this information with you. And one thing I like to say is that things aren't what they seem to be in the media. One of the questions I challenge people all the time, especially African Americans and African American pastors, is because many of them describe what they call white supremacy. And white supremacy, which I defined in one of my previous videos, that how they define white supremacy and how they adhere to the belief that white supremacy is still alive and strong and well in America, which I disagree with. I mean, like I said, if you go through, I'm not going to go back into the whole back and forth about what white supremacy actually is and how it affects us or doesn't affect us here in 2021. But one of the things that I like to challenge people with is the idea that if Black people not even just Black people, there's a lot of non-Blacks who also adhere to this idea of white supremacy, And so if you believe in white supremacy, then you would also have to believe that mainstream media, the large media companies, are owned by what you would describe as white supremacy. So based on them owning white supremacy, the mainstream media, and understanding exactly what white supremacy is, then how do you believe that they're telling you the truth? Because one of the things that white supremacy does by definition is it believes that white people are superior to other people, especially Black people, and their job is to suppress or oppress Black people or keep them in a oppressive state. So if that's the case, why do we believe that the mainstream media, which is would have to be owned by white supremacy or the institution of white supremacy? Why do we believe that they're telling us things to help us or to benefit us? And so if I believe that they would most likely lie to me, then I should also be skeptical of the information they give me, because their ultimate goal is to cause confusion, cause disruption, cause mistrust among the various groups of people. And it goes back some time, but I want to go back and just come through historically and talk about these things. First of all, I need to establish the fact that there probably it might have been some people that maybe adhered to the tenets of white supremacy in Washington, D.C. that went into the Capitol, but that's not what that was about. And for people to believe that that was white supremacy on display means that they are intentionally believing a lie, or not intentionally, but they're believing a lie, or they just want to ignore actual facts, because that wasn't about white supremacy. That was about standing up for a perceived violation of rights, right? These were patriots. These were people that loved the country. For the most part, the sentiment behind was they believe that they love the country. And because of that, they believe that their rights have been violated or have been stolen. The other fallacy that I want to address as I move forward through this is I've heard a lot of people say, if that was Black people storming a governmental building like that, they would have all been shot or killed, or they would have been very heavy-handed with their response. And for people to say that, it basically you're ignoring almost all of 2020, with the riots all over the country, with George Floyd in Minneapolis and other places. In Minneapolis, they actually took over a police precinct, physically took it over and occupied it, ran the police out. In Seattle, Washington, they had a place that was called a autonomous zone, where they occupied, I think it was about 100 days, they occupied it and forbid the cops to come out. I saw riots all over the country. I saw police officers in Washington, D.C. that were spit on. They were insulted to their face. They were threatened. I saw all these things, and these police officers stood firm and didn't do anything. And so for someone to perpetuate the fallacy that just because they were white is why they were able to do what they did is ignoring actual events that have occurred in the year 2020. Like I said, all over the city, all over the country, all over the cities of the country. People were burning buildings down, they were rioting, they were looting, and there were very little incidences of police gunning people down or killing people during those riots after the death of George Floyd. So we need to stop. Just because someone says it in mainstream media, we have to use our wisdom, we have to use our understanding, and we have to look at things factually and intelligently so that we don't fall victim to the deception of mainstream media. They're promoting an agenda, and that agenda is not an agenda that necessarily is our best interest. It's in their best interest. Mainstream media is doing things that are based on their own best interest and not ours. But anyway, let's move forward a little bit. So let me break some things down to you. Mainstream media is one of the tools that the globalists use, because this is all about the globalists, not about white supremacy or anything else. It's about those that adhere to the New World Order idea or ideology. Globalism is a one world government ideology, and that's what these people adhere to. And so you have people that are part of this conspiracy, and then you have people that carry out the agenda for them, and they usually get rewarded through money or through fame and fortune and different things. And this is a real thing. This is a fact. I know a lot of people say, oh man, you're just making things up, but I'm going to explain it. I'm going to break it down a little bit for you. And part of this whole thing of fanning the flames of race is not a new concept. It's an old concept, because what happens is the powers that be have historically gotten people to fight against each other by fanning the flames of racism and having these false flag occurrences. And what it does is it keeps people distracted from the real issues that are occurring. It keeps people distracted from the real issues that are occurring. And there are some people that is their job, to just point to racism all the time, especially in the Black community. Racism, racism, racism. It's like the boy that cried wolf, right? The sky is falling, the sky is falling. And that's their job, to perpetuate this idea constantly of racism in every step of the imagination. Now, again, this is not a new concept, and it goes back. I'm going to give you a quote from the great Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was the founder of Tuskegee University. And here's a quote from him. Now, this quote is well over 100 years old. And Booker T. Washington, he lived in the 19th century. And here is a quote from Booker T. Washington. He says, "There is another class of colored people who make a business of keeping the troubles, the wrongs, and the hardships of the Negro race before the public. Having learned that they are able to make a living out of their troubles, they have grown into the settled habit of advertising their wrongs, partly because they want sympathy and partly because it pays. Some of these people do not want the Negro to lose his grievances because they do not want to lose their jobs." That was a quote from Booker T. Washington, founder of Tuskegee University and a great civil rights leader throughout history. And so, amen. Thank you. Amen. And so we have to understand that this is not a new phenomenon. This is something that has happened. One of the things that we will see historically is that after slavery was abolished in 1865, with the Emancipation Proclamation being fully executed, you had an influx, a building up of the Black community. And so one of the people, Margaret Sanger, was a eugenicist, and she believed in, reducing the populations of Black people. She started Planned Parenthood. In 1913, she had this thing called the Bureau of Social Hygiene. And she believed that if you got rid of certain groups of people, especially Black people, that society as a whole would be better. You have philosophers like Galton. If you guys get a chance, research Galton, Darwin, and also Malthus. These were all people that believed in eugenics. So Galton, who came up with the idea of survival of the fittest, he believed that there are weaker strands of humanity, and that over time in evolution, that the weaker strands of humanity will go away, right? But people like Charles and Malthus and Margaret Sanger, they believe that to be true. They believe that the weaker parts of humanity, the weaker gene pool, if you will, of humanity will eventually die out, right? Because that's what evolution does. Evolution is that the weaker traits die out and the stronger traits survive. So they believe that. And because they were pushing this idea of race and race theory, they believe that the black people who were less evolved than white people actually were the weaker link of society, among others, but especially black people. And they believe that society, that humanity itself would weed out these weaker vessels, but they believe that it would take too long. And so you had to help the evolutionary process along. That's where they came up with the concept of eugenics, which is good genes, right? So they encourage people with good genes to have babies and to procreate, and they discourage people with weaker genes like black people and other minority ethnic groups not to procreate. They also had sterilization. They would promote sterilization of black people and others. They also promote the idea of birth control and Planned Parenthood. And so that was the idea behind that. And the Rockefeller family, and I have been talking about them, so I'm just very briefly talk about them. They are globalists, right? And so when you talk about the globalists and the ruling elite, if you will, there's two different groups of people. You have the people that are certain bloodline families. The Rockefellers are one of the bloodline families of the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, and there's some other bloodline families. So they believe that there's bloodline families. Thank you, Debbie Godzi. Thank you. These bloodline families, they believe that those are the good genes, right? Even the royal family, which are the Windsors. The Windsors actually originated from Germany, and they changed their name to the Windsors because the German Nazis got a bad reputation. So that's where you get the idea of the royal family. They believe that they have the good genetics or the good genes, and that's why a lot of times in the royal families, they intermarry to keep their bloodline pure. So you have people that are part of the bloodline, right? They believe that the rest of humanity, not just black people, but the rest of humanity are like human weeds, and that they believe that the resources of the world belong to them, and that you have to get rid of the weaker gene pool of humanity so that they don't absorb all of the good resources. That's where Margaret Sanger come up with the idea of calling black people and others human weeds. She says that we will drain the good resources from the higher gene pool, right? And so you come up with this idea of eugenics, and just to show you, a lot of times I say these things and people think I'm making it up. Understand that I'm a researcher. I research these things. This is Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of the Species Through Natural Selection, right? And I quoted from this from many times. This is where you get the idea of the theory of evolution. And like I said, they believe that certain genetic strands, certain bloodlines are the better quality genetics, and that you should promote them to have more children. And you discourage the weaker genes from having children and procreating. And ultimately, eugenics is to get rid of those who have the weaker genes. Now, to show you and to prove to you what I'm saying is true, this is what the theory of evolution is based on Charles Darwin's book on the origin of the species through natural selection, right? The subtitle, I don't know if you can see it or not, but I'll read it to you. The subtitle of this book is The Origin of the Species Through Natural Selection. The subtitle is Or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, right? So that's what Charles Darwin promoted, the idea that certain races were less evolved. That's where you get the idea of eugenics or good genes. This is Margaret Sanger's book, The Pivot of Civilization. And in her book, she talked about the fact that, because of the Industrial Revolution and the population of the earth was spreading so fast, and especially with the liberation of the slaves, that they were now able to mingle among society, and there was interbreeding going on. And many people don't know, but it used to be illegal for biracial marriages, right? A black person and a white person. And here's an interesting fact, and I wasn't going to go down this path, but I want to introduce this. I think it's ironic that the state of Virginia's logo is Virginia's for lovers. But there was a court case, the state of Virginia versus the Loving family. And it was a white man and a black woman that wanted to get married, but it was illegal in Virginia for interracial marriages. And so it's interesting that their logo now is Virginia's for lovers. They got sued and they lost the lawsuit because they made it illegal to. And the reason that it was illegal to marry interracial marriage, because they believed that black people had inferior genes and they wanted to purify or keep the white genes pure, right? That's where you get the idea of white supremacy. So I think it's ironic that a lot of black people who are fighting against white supremacy, but they are pro-abortion or pro-Planned Parenthood. And Margaret Sanger, let me see, I'm going to give you guys a quick quote from Margaret Sanger. This is how she feels about people. It says, these young men, this is page 25 of this particular book. These young men were children of yesterday. Authorities tell us that 75% of school children are defective. This means that no less than 15 million school children out of 22 million in the United States are physically or mentally below par. That's one of the many places that she says she calls people morons and imbeciles, and that they are a weak stock, human weeds. Those are the terms that she uses, right? So anyway, let me fast forward it. So Margaret Sanger, who was a white supremacist and a eugenicist, it wasn't really white, just white. It was a certain group of people that they believe were the elite. So she came up with the idea of eugenics in America and getting rid of black people. She had help from a gentleman who some of you may be familiar with by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois, who's one of the founders of the NAACP, also held to the same ideology that Margaret Sanger did. And I'm going to get back to that, but I need to make a statement that the majority of black civil rights organizations are not native. They're not organic. They weren't created by black people. They were created by forces that wanted to control black people. I want to say that again. Most black organizations like the NAACP and the Urban League and others were not created by black people. They weren't organic. They were created by people who wanted to control black people. So I needed to make that statement so that now this next statement is going to put things in its proper context. So W.E.B. Du Bois also believed that. He believed in this idea of what's called the talented 10th. And so the talented 10th is this idea that only the top 10% of black people were basically worthy, right? So they looked to identify the 10%, and they wanted to use the top 10% in order to control the rest of the 90% of black people. And so not only did he believe that, but he actually helped to fund Margaret Sanger's Negro Project. And it was called the Negro Project. There's a book if you get a chance to get this. And the Negro Project was, what were we going to do with the black dilemma, or the Negro dilemma, which was the overpopulation of black people they felt was going to bring society down. And so what they did is they created these organizations to identify black people, use them to control the rest of the black people, right? You have these people, like I just said with Booker T. Washington's quote, that these people are, it's like a cancer clinic, right? It would be more money to treat cancer than to cure cancer. And so they would never cure, you know, I mean, I'm not saying, I'm just using a general term. And so if you ran a cancer clinic, it would be more profitable for you to treat the symptoms of cancer than to cure cancer. Because if you gave a cure to cancer, the person would be cured and then you wouldn't get any more money. But if you can constantly cured cancer, people would keep coming back and then you could continue to make money. So these people that are basically race, what's the word I want to use? They continue to instigate things, right? They always want to point out racism in every situation, but there's never a solution because it's not supposed to be a solution. They just keep fanning the flames as a way to control the masses. And so the media is one of the tools that help to do that. But what they did is with W.E.B. Du Bois, they helped to fund the Negro Project, but they also helped this organization called the Black Boule. And I want to talk to you about that and then give you some other historical facts to back up what I'm saying. So on May 15th, 1904, this fraternity called Sigma Pi Phi Fraternity, also known as the Boule, was formed in Philadelphia, PA. Dr. Mentor and some of the other people formed this organization. And what it was done, it was to identify the elite of the Black community and to use them, to put them in places of power and authority. But they would never, ever help to solve the issues of Black people, but they would be sitting in a place of influence. Now, and that the organization is still alive. And it's unfortunate that a lot of our, what they call Black leaders, were members of that. So what happens is you had the Black Boule that was created in 1904, and it was patterned after Yale's Skull and Bones. And some of you may be familiar with Skull and Bones. Skull and Bones actually is an organization in Yale University, and former presidents and CIA people and many other influential fraternity. And so Skull and Bone, I mean, Boule was created to pattern after that organization. And so what happens is they always are put in positions of power. They're put in positions as being the leaders of the community, but they ultimately are promoting the ideas of those who are the ruling elite, right? They never ever help to solve the issues in the Black community, but they are very quick to point them out and to steer the Black community in the direction that the ruling elite want them to be steered in. And that is what's happening now, even in America. There's a lot of Black leaders that are put in places as Black leaders, but they never talk about the real issues. They always fan flames of racism in a way that just keeps people agitated and aggravated. I talked about Colin Kaepernick and his protests, and a lot of people had a problem with how I said it or what I said, because I said that was a classic case of controlled opposition. And I'm not saying that Colin Kaepernick intentionally did that. He may not have realized it. I think that we made him into something that he wasn't really trying to be. He just knelt and said he wanted equality for Black people in America, basically. And I paraphrase it. But that's a classic example of what is called controlled opposition. And so it looked like they were really fighting against racism, which, first of all, the NFL is not the place to decry racism, because 70% of the NFL are Black. And they make exorbitant amounts of money for playing ball, and it's based on their talents. It's not based on whether or not anybody likes them or whether they're Black or white. It's very close to what's called a meritocracy, which means you're rewarded based on your merits and what you do. So you get these big, huge contracts, and you get these contracts because you play football well and you help your team to win. And so color is really has very little to do with playing football. But yet that's the place that he chose to protest, even though he was talking about police brutality in other places. But ultimately, why not go to the source? He could have met with police forces. He could have met with mayors of cities. He could have done those type of things. Instead, he chose to protest at a football game. But anyway, the Boule has been put in place, and it comes from the Greek idea of the lower house of parliament, is charged with organizing the affairs of the city for the king. And so this is the ancient idea of the Boule, is they are to organize, they organize the affairs for the Black community. The New World Order is the old world order. Basically, it's the same thing that has happened before. And the symbol of the Boule is the griffin. And many of you may be familiar with this animal or may not be. It looks almost like the Sphinx. So the griffin, or gryphon, is ancient Greek. It's a legendary creature with the body, tail, and back legs of a lion, the head and wings of those talons on his front feet. Because the lion was traditionally considered the king of the beasts, the eagle was the king of the birds. Was thought to be especially powerful, majestic creature, since classic were known for guarding treasures and priceless possessions. And so these people, another word for these people in Boule, are gatekeepers. So they're basically gatekeepers. They're put in positions of power with wealth and being famous, but they actually are the ones who help promote or promote the agenda of the globalists or the New World Order. If you look at LeBron James has a tattoo of a griffin on his chest, which means he's part of this Boule, right? He's chosen because he's an extremely good basketball player and a great athlete. And so because of that, those are the type of people they put in place. Now, when you talk about the Boule, they call them archons, 5,000 plus archons, which are male Boule members, and their wives are called archousis, with 112 chapters, make up the wealthiest group of Black men and women on the planet. Archon actually means demon, the kind that you kept hidden. Now, after slavery and the Black community was very powerful, very strong, it was building up, I should say, it was becoming very strong. You had this gentleman by the name of Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey was, he was a person organizing Black people to come together strong. And he even had this Back to Africa movement. He had made he had made a deal, I think it was Liberia, that they would give black people their own land. He was a segregationalist, and he was saying that in order to, he didn't believe that black people could ever coexist here in America, so they were going to have their own place, right? But Marcus Garvey was very a wealthy man. He was a very forward-thinking, intelligent man, and he was very successful. So they came up with this idea of the Boule to counter what he did. So the Boule not only counteracted what Marcus Garvey did, but it continually promote the idea of desegregation, of integration of black people into the larger community. If you think about it, most of the bad things that happen when you force people to live together. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't try to get people to live together, but usually it was desegregation and integration that caused most of the issues after slavery was abolished, right? So they continue to promote this idea of black people integrating in white society, also gaining acceptance. And what that did was that actually weakened the black community and black businesses, right? So Marcus Garvey was a very strong and powerful leader. And they created the Boule. This is a quote that's attributed to W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the founding member of the New York City chapter of the Boule. The Boule was created to keep black professionals away from Marcus Garvey. The remaking of the House Negro was necessary to institute a group of blacks who had vested interest in protecting the elite white system. One thing that needs to be pointed out is the time period. So Marcus Garvey had a Back to Africa movement, and he was reaching millions plus people. And because of that, they had to offset that, right? So then you had the Black Boule, and out of that, you had the creation or the development of what's known as the Divine Nine. And so that's the what's known as the black fraternities and sororities. So you have Alpha Phi Alpha, Alpha Kappa Psi, Alpha Phi Alpha, Kappa Alpha Psi, Omega Psi Phi, Phi Beta Sigma are the four male fraternities. You have Alpha Kappa Alpha, Delta Sigma Theta, Zeta Phi Beta, and Sigma Gamma Rho are the female black Greek letter organizations. And if you think about, we're talking about Greeks, right? The Boule comes from ancient Greek. These Greek letter organizations come from the idea of the Greeks, and they are basically gatekeepers. I'm not talking about everyone. I know and have a lot of good friends and family members that are part of Black Greek letter organizations. I'm talking about the ideology behind the foundation. And I always think it's kind of ironic that Black people choose Greek letter organizations when it was the ancient Greeks that went into Egypt and Africa and not only enslaved many of the Africans, but they also stole their science and technology and gave it for themselves, stole it and used it for themselves. If you look at Greek mythology is actually based on Egyptian mythology. So they stole their language, not their language, their knowledge. They enslaved the people, but yet we have Black people that are part of Black Greek letter organizations. Now, this is important to understand because most of the leaders that are put in place in the Black community are part of these. They're part of either the Divine Nine or the Boule or both, or some type of Masonic organization. So you have W.B. Du Bois and Alan Locke, and you also have Cecil Rhodes, where you get the idea Rhodes Scholar from. They publicly defiled Marcus Garvey by calling him names, and they actually sabotaged his movement. And if you guys know anything about Cecil Rhodes, where you get the idea of the Rhodes Scholar from, Cecil Rhodes was a globalist. He's the one that helped to colonize Africa, like Sierra Leone and some of these other places. At one point, the nation was called Rhodesia in Africa. It's named after Cecil Rhodes. That's where you get the idea. The De Beers Diamond Company, they went in and colonized Africa and stole their natural resources, especially the diamonds, right? And it caused a lot of civil wars and fighting in Africa because they had all the money. They came in and they would pit the Africans against each other, and they took their resources. So these are not a new thing, but I just wanted to talk to you about these things. When you see these things in place, you should realize that these things are not organic. Some of the protests, some of the riots that have happened around the country are instigated by the powers that be behind the scenes, right? During the civil rights movement, and even during the 30s and the 40s, they would come in and infiltrate Black organizations, and they would steer them in the direction that helped them and get Black people involved. But it never meant any positive change for the Black community. And they use the media. So right now you're seeing the media that is using their basic propaganda tactics in order to shape the narrative. And so we have to be careful not to just buy into the media narrative, but we have to get to a place where we start to look at things from a historical perspective and reality. Look at the actual facts, do your own research. Don't just take your, take these things for granted. Let me tell you historically some of the people that were members of the Boule. And like I said, it should kind of click for you that that's the reason why the black people 150 years plus after slavery are still having the same complaints that they did many years ago, 50 years after the civil rights movement. And we still have many of the same grievances that we've had in the past. It's because of, like I said, with the quote from Booker T. Washington, there are people that put in place that are just to fan the flames of racism and bigotry and bias, but they never give you a real solution. It keeps you in a perpetual state of being stressed out and tense and fighting and mistrust, because they are framing the narrative. They are framing the narrative. And you think about, like, for instance, in Chicago, you have some of the biggest civil rights leaders. You have Louis Farrakhan, you have Jesse Jackson, you have, even President Barack Obama, who hails from Chicago. But yet Chicago has one of the worst conditions for Black people. And it has nothing to do with white supremacy. It has to do with the agenda that they push and promote. If you look at most communities in the inner cities that are run by Black people or have a large Black population, they're usually run by Democrats. They're usually by these leaders that they put in place to promote the same agendas, and nothing ever changes. And then they have these get out the vote campaigns. And during the get out the vote campaigns, people just basically go out and vote for the same principles and people and groups that they've always voted for, which is why nothing ever changes. Anyway, the last thing I want to share with you is I could go into more detail. I was going to mention some of the people that were part of the Boule. So you had, let me see here, W.E.B. Du Bois, as I talked about, Carter G. Woodson, who is considered the founder of Black History Month, and ASALH, which is the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. You have Charles Drew, who's a great physician, James Weldon Johnson, who's the author of Lift Every Voice, L. Douglas Wilder, who was the first Black governor in the United States. He was the governor of Virginia. Martin Luther King was part of that. Who else do you have? You have James Clyburn of South Carolina. You have John Lewis and Elijah Cummings, which is why if you look in those districts that Elijah Cummings and John Lewis governed over for many, many decades, it was some of the worst conditions for Black people in the country. And so they get propped up as civil rights leaders and people that are fighting for the Black community, yet nothing ever changes and conditions don't improve. They just continually get progressively worse. And that's because that's not their goal. Their goal is not to resolve it. Their goal is being identified as these talented 10th people just to receive the accolades, to be put in positions of power and receive all the benefits of in that position that they sit in. And so the last thing I want to talk to you about is what's called the counterintelligence program. So after the civil rights movement, the FBI actually came up with these counterintelligence programs. They called it for hate groups and racial groups, but it was very much underhanded things that were going on. So for instance, you had organizations like the Black Panther Party. And so here's what happened with the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party was originally created as a breakfast program for children and a defense group in Oakland, California. They felt that there was a lot of police brutality. And so the white people would come in and arrest Black people, target them. This was back in the 60s and 50s. And then there was a lot of poverty in the community. So they had this breakfast program where they would give a hot breakfast for children in the morning, because they believed that children could learn better if their stomachs were full. And when you have a lot of poverty, you have kids that go to school hungry. So they started a breakfast program and a defense program to keep Black people from being targeted for police brutality and those type of things, right? So anyway, over time, they became very strong and they had a very strong voice in the community. So what the FBI did and the other intelligence groups did was they would send in a Black person to infiltrate the organization. Sometimes during protests, they would be the ones that stir up a riot, right? Even if it was a peaceful protest, they would be the ones that stir up a riot to start the protest. and they would set them up to get arrested. They would spy on these leaders, and they would send information back. And so you had this thing, and this is a memo from March the 4th, 1968. It was from the FBI's the Counterintelligence Program, Black Nationalist Hate Groups, Racial Intelligence. COINTELPRO, it's called. COINTELPRO is Counterintelligence Program, right? It means that they go in and, like I said, agent provocateurs, they call them, or controlled opposition. So they go in and pretend like they're in opposition to the agenda, but they're actually working for the people. That there are like some of these would go in and act like they were activists and anti-government people, but they actually work for the government. That's a COINTELPRO. So the COINTELPRO, the job of it was to hinder the political actions for radical Black and American population. In unity, their strength, the document admits fearfully, right? So they're saying that when Black community is unified, they were very strong. And so in order to get rid of the unity in the Black community, they would send in COINTELPRO people. They would send in agent provocateurs, counterintelligence people, right, in order to keep the Black community from being unified. So a lot of people always say, well, how come we can't ever come together? It's because it's not designed that way. They always put in agents to do so. Their goal was to prevent the rise of what they call a messiah, who could unify and electrify the militant Black nationalist movement. Malcolm X might have been such a messiah. He is the martyr of the movement today. Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, and Elijah Muhammad all aspire to this position. Elijah Muhammad is less of a threat because of his age. King could be very contender for this position should he abandon his supposed obedience to white liberal doctrines of nonviolence and embrace Black nationalism. Carmichael has the necessary charisma to be a threat in this way. Stokely Carmichael, if you guys are familiar. Fred Hampton in Detroit was also a great young leader, and he was targeted and he was assassinated basically by the intelligence agencies. In 1967, the FBI officially initialized the Black nationalist wing of the COINTELPRO counterintelligence program, operation authorizing the use of illegal means to subvert protest groups, handled by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. The program sought to dissolve groups from within, sparkling conflicts, plotting assassinations, and even pressure leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. to commit suicide. There was actually a famous writing, a letter that was written to Martin Luther King. Some people say it was written by J. Edgar Hoover, telling Dr. King he should just kill himself because of, you know, some things that were supposedly going on in his private life. But the reason I wanted to share this with you, because when we talk about white supremacy, that is a thing that is put out there in order to keep people to get distracted. People get distracted. One of the things that X actually exposed in the 1960s was there was a group of rich globalists. I think they're called the Hunt Brothers or someone like that out of Texas, and I could be wrong on the name of the group, but they actually was funding not only the KKK, but the Nation of Islam at the same time. They were funding both groups at the same time because what they were to do is, and these groups are in direct opposition to each other. So because of that, you can control the narrative. You hear me talk about the Hegelian dialectic and those type of things. And so when you understand the powers that be and how they work, that you can see that happening right now in America. And so the leaders that they usually put in position, especially in the Black community, are usually chosen and picked, and they're not offering real solutions. They're ignoring real issues. And so we can't get caught up in the madness. Mainstream media is one of the worst culprits of this, which is why I started off talking about how they immediately tried to make the siege on Washington Capitol a race thing. And it wasn't a race thing. It was people that believed that their country is being stolen. And I thought it was ironic because during the riots, after the death of George Floyd, there were peaceful protests, but there was a lot of rioting as well. If you set a building on fire, I consider that a riot, just personal preference. And so what happened is they had these protests all summer long, right? And they occupied certain buildings and different things like that. And you kept hearing this phrase that rioting is the cry of the voiceless, crying out for attention, right? They kept saying that. They kept saying rioting is the voice of the voiceless, crying out for attention. But then now, when they said that there was a riot on the United States Capitol, it's because these people are insurgents. They are vile people, and they're all white supremacists, which is not the case. But I believe that a lot of that was agent provocateurs. I believe it was people that were sent in there to stir up things on both sides. There were Black Lives Matter people there. One got arrested. There were Antifa people there. There were most likely there probably was insurrectionists and white supremacists there, but that wasn't the theme of the demonstration. Originally was supposed to be for people that felt like their voices weren't being heard. And so I say all this for us to look beyond the surface, stop just being spoon-fed mainstream media's narrative, and really start to understand things from a historical perspective and from a biblical perspective. Because we know what the Bible says, that Satan is the author of confusion, right? He's the one who divides people and divide and conquer people in order to promote his agenda. And he wants to keep us hating each other so that we can't look at the humanity of each person on every side in order for us to move forward and have a great society, but we know ultimately the only peace that we have comes from Jesus. And so anyway, that's a couple of my thoughts. I'll share some more. This was a little bit longer than what I intended, but there was some information I really wanted to get to you. And so hopefully you'll like the information, you receive something from it, and you can please like the video, share, and subscribe to the channel so that we can continue to give out information to keep people's eyes wide open. Till next time, this is Joe Green. Peace and blessings to you. Shalom.